I stared at the resignation letter on my desk, my hands trembling slightly as I signed my name Olivia Mitchell. After 15 years of working at Mitchell Industries, I was finally breaking free. The family company my grandfather had built from nothing, the empire my father had expanded, and the legacy my older brother Marcus was destined to inherit, I was walking away from it all. The corner office I'd occupied for the past 5 years felt suffocating. Despite its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline, the space had always seemed to shrink around me, especially during board meetings where my ideas were consistently overlooked in favor of Marcus's more traditional approaches. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "The board is ready for you," Jessica, my assistant, announced quietly. She'd been with me for 7 years, one of the few people who truly understood what I was about to do. I gathered my papers and straightened my blazer. Time to face the firing squad. The Mitchell Industries boardroom hadn't changed since my grandfather's time. The same mahogany table, the same leather chairs, the same oil painting of our founder hanging prominently on the wall. As I walked in, 12 pairs of eyes turned to me, but only 3 mattered. My father's disappointed glare, my brother's smug smile, and my mother's carefully neutral expression. "Olivia," my father Richard Mitchell spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades as CEO. "We've reviewed your proposal. Surely you understand how ridiculous this sounds." I remained standing, refusing to take my usual seat at the far end of the table. "There's nothing ridiculous about wanting to modernize our approach, Dad. The market is changing. If we don't adapt, the market." Marcus interrupted, leaning back in his chair, my grandfather's chair. "You mean your little pet project? Digital transformation? Cloud computing? Mitchell Industries has survived for 60 years doing things our way." "Surviving isn't thriving," I countered, pulling up the presentation I'd prepared. "Our market share has dropped 15% in the last 2 years. Our biggest clients are moving to more innovative competitors. If we don't embrace digital transformation now, enough." My father's hand slammed down on the table. "Mitchell Industries doesn't need transformation. We need stability, tradition, proven methods." I looked around the room at the board members who'd watched me grow up. "Is that what you all think? That we should just keep doing things the same way until we become obsolete?" The silence was deafening. Even those who secretly agreed with me wouldn't dare speak against Richard Mitchell, especially not with Marcus sitting there like a crown prince waiting for his coronation. "Well," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "then you leave me no choice." I pulled out my resignation letter. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down from my position as Chief Innovation Officer. The room erupted. Board members whispered among themselves, my mother's perfect composure cracked slightly, and my father's face turned an alarming shade of red. But it was Marcus who spoke first, his laughter cutting through the chaos. "You're quitting? Over this?" He stood up, straightening his custom-made suit. "And what exactly do you plan to do, little sister? Start your own company? Compete with Mitchell Industries?" I met his gaze steadily. "Actually, yes." The laughter died in his throat. My father stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. "Have you lost your mind? Everything you are, everything you have, is because of this company. Because of this family." "No," I corrected him, "everything I am is because of my own hard work. Work that's been ignored, dismissed, and undervalued for 15 years. "You ungrateful my father started, but I cut him off. "I've already secured funding. I have a business plan, potential clients "Who would never work with you if they knew you were betraying Mitchell Industries," Marcus sneered. "Face it, Olivia. You're nothing without the Mitchell name." I smiled, thinking of the contracts already signed under my mother's maiden name, Stewart. "We'll see about that. If you walk out that door," my father's voice was cold, "don't expect to come back. Ever." I looked at my mother, seeing a flicker of something fear, in her eyes before she looked away. Then I turned to the painting of my grandfather, remembering his words from years ago. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the bravest thing you can do is start over." "Goodbye, Dad." I placed my resignation letter on the table. "I hope you remember this moment." Marcus followed me to my office, watching as I packed my personal belongings into a single box. "You'll fail," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You'll come crawling back within 6 months, begging for your old job." I picked up my box, walking past him. "Goodbye, Marcus." "You'll be nobody without us," he called after me. "Nobody." The elevator ride down 60 floors gave me time to breathe to steady my nerves. In the lobby, Jessica waited with her own box of belongings. "You don't have to do this," I told her. She smiled. "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss this for the world." Outside, New York summer air hit us like a wall of heat. I looked up at the Mitchell Industries building, my family's legacy, my golden cage for the past 15 years. "Ready?" Jessica asked. I nodded, hailing a taxi. Time to build something of our own. The next 6 months were a blur of 18-hour workdays, endless meetings, and countless cups of coffee. I'd rented a small office in Brooklyn, nothing like my corner suite at Mitchell Industries, but it was mine. Stewart Digital Solutions, named after my mother's maiden name, started small but grew quickly. My experience at Mitchell Industries had taught me what large companies really needed, not just digital transformation but a complete rethinking of how they operated in the modern world. We secured our first major client within 2 months, a mid-sized manufacturing company that Mitchell Industries had dismissed as too small to bother with. When that company's efficiency increased by 40% after implementing our solutions, others started noticing. By month 4 we had to move to a larger office. By month 6 we had 30 employees and a waiting list of clients. I kept my identity carefully hidden, operating as Stewart. The business world knew me only as a promising newcomer with an uncanny understanding of traditional industries' needs. Every time Mitchell Industries lost a client to us, Marcus would send out angry emails about loyalty and tradition. I saved each one, printing them out and keeping them in a folder labeled Motivation. Then came the day that changed everything. I was reviewing quarterly reports when Jessica burst into my office, her face flushed with excitement. "Olivia, you need to see this." She handed me her tablet, open to a financial news article. The headline made my heart stop. "Mitchell Industries faces crisis as major clients jump ship." I skimmed the article, taking in phrases like falling market share, and failure to modernize, and seeking new leadership. But one detail caught my eye. They were planning to hire a new chief technology officer to help modernize their operations. "There's more," Jessica said, pulling up another email. "We just received a resume for our senior executive position. You'll never guess who it's from." I looked at the name on the application and couldn't help but laugh. Marcus Mitchell, my brother who'd sworn I'd be nothing without the family name, was applying for a job at my company. And he had no idea who he'd be working for. Jessica watched me carefully. "The interview slots are open next week. Should I schedule him?" I leaned back in my chair, thinking of all the times Marcus had dismissed my ideas, belittled my achievements, and claimed I'd be nothing without him. Now here he was unknowingly begging me for a job. "Schedule it for Monday," I said, a smile playing on my lips. "I think it's time for a family reunion." Monday morning arrived with a weight of anticipation. I stood in my corner office at Stewart Digital Solutions' new headquarters, straightening my Chanel suit, a small indulgence I'd allowed myself after our first $1 million contract. The view wasn't as high as my old Mitchell Industries office, but somehow I could see further. "Marcus Mitchell has arrived," Jessica announced through the intercom. "He's 15 minutes early." I smiled, remembering how he used to mock my habit of arriving early to meetings. "How does he look?" "Different," Jessica replied. "No custom suit today. He actually seems nervous. Put him in conference room A. Let him wait." I spent the next 30 minutes reviewing his resume, though I hardly needed to. Every accomplishment listed was something I'd witnessed firsthand, many of them projects I'd actually spearheaded while he took the credit. The irony wasn't lost on me. At exactly 9:15 I walked into the conference room. Marcus sat with his back to the door, his shoulders tense under his off-the-rack suit. The past 6 months hadn't been kind to him, his hair had more gray and he'd lost weight. "Mr. Mitchell," I said coolly, watching him stand and turn. "Thank you for coming in today." The moment of recognition was everything I'd imagined. His face went from professional smile to shock to disbelief in the span of seconds. "Olivia. Actually, it's Ms. Stewart here." I sat down at the head of the table, gesturing for him to do the same. "Or did you forget that's Mom's maiden name?" He remained standing, his face flushing red. "This is impossible. You own Stewart Digital Solutions." "Sit down, Marcus." My voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Unless you'd prefer to end this interview now? He sank into his chair looking like someone had just pulled the world out from under his feet. When? Let's review your application, shall we? I opened his file. You're applying for our senior executive position. Impressive resume. Though I notice you left out some details about your current situation at Mitchell Industries. This is a joke, he muttered. You're doing this to humiliate me. Actually, I'm doing this because you applied for a job. I met his gaze steadily. Unless you'd like to explain to our board why Mitchell Industries' market share has dropped 40% under your leadership? The fight seemed to drain out of him. You knew, he said quietly. All this time, you knew what was happening to the company. I warned you, I replied, my voice neutral. I warned all of you. Digital transformation wasn't just a pet project, Marcus. It was survival. He ran a hand through his graying hair. Dad's sick, he said suddenly. The stress. After we lost Apex Industries to your company, though we didn't know it was yours then, he had a minor heart attack. I felt a twinge of concern but kept my expression professional. I'm sorry to hear that. How's Mom taking it? He hesitated. She asks about you. Every Sunday dinner she looks at your empty chair. The same chair I sat in while you and Dad dismissed every idea I ever had? I raised an eyebrow. The same dinners where you both explained why I'd never understand business the way you did? Marcus had the grace to look ashamed. We were wrong, he admitted, the words seeming to physically pain him. Everything you predicted. It all happened exactly as you said it would. I leaned back, studying my brother. The arrogant crown prince was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood how wrong he'd been. Why did you apply here, Marcus? The truth. He took a deep breath. Because Stewart Digital Solutions is the only company successfully modernizing traditional industries without destroying them. Does your methods work? Because. He looked down at his hands. Because I need help. You need help, I repeated slowly. Like I needed help when I proposed these exact solutions 2 years ago? Olivia, please. His voice cracked slightly. Mitchell Industries is dying. Dad's too sick to run things. I'm in over my head and our biggest clients are all talking to other firms. You need me, I finished for him. The sister you said would be nobody without the Mitchell name. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 2 decades of rivalry, resentment, and regret. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I was wrong. About everything. You've built something extraordinary here all on your own. Meanwhile, I'm watching our family's legacy crumble because I was too proud to admit I didn't have all the answers. I stood up, walking to the window. Below, New York City bustled with its usual energy, unaware of the drama unfolding in this room. Do you know what the hardest part was, Marcus? It wasn't starting over. It wasn't building this company. It was knowing that my own family had so little faith in me that they couldn't even imagine I might succeed without them. I know, he said quietly. And I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I turned back to face him. Stewart Digital Solutions doesn't hire based on family connections. If you want a position here, you'll have to earn it. Starting at the bottom. His head snapped up. You'd actually consider hiring me? As a junior consultant, I specified. No executive title. No corner office. You'll report to people younger than you, work longer hours than you're used to, and prove yourself just like everyone else here has to. He swallowed hard. Yes. Whatever it takes. I pressed the intercom. Jessica, please bring in the standard employment contract. Then I looked at Marcus. One more thing. Dad needs to know who he's dealing with. If Mitchell Industries wants Stewart Digital Solutions' help, they need to know exactly who they'll be answering to. Marcus nodded slowly. He won't take it well. No, I agreed, but he'll have to learn. Just like you did. The next week I walked into Mitchell Industries for the first time in 6 months. The security guard did a double take when he saw me, but my old badge still worked. Nothing had changed in the lobby. Same marble floors, same giant logo, same portrait of my grandfather. The boardroom, however, felt different. My father sat at the head of the table, looking smaller than I remembered. His illness had aged him, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. When I walked in, those eyes widened in shock. Hello, Dad, I said calmly. I believe you wanted to meet with the CEO of Stewart Digital Solutions? The silence was absolute. Board members who dismissed me for years now sat up straighter. My mother, sitting beside my father, pressed a hand to her mouth. And my father, for the first time in my life I saw him completely speechless. Olivia, he finally managed. You built the company that's been taking your clients? Yes. I took my brother's old seat, my grandfather's chair. Now, shall we discuss how to save Mitchell Industries? What followed was the longest board meeting of my life. I laid out exactly what needed to happen: complete digital transformation, management restructuring, and a merger between Stewart Digital Solutions and Mitchell Industries. My company would take the lead, with the Mitchell name becoming a subsidiary of Stewart Digital Solutions. This is outrageous, my father finally exploded. You expect me to hand over my company to you? After you abandoned us? No, Dad, I met his gaze steadily. I expect you to save your company by accepting help from the daughter you never believed in. The choice is yours. My mother spoke for the first time. Richard, she said softly, listen to her. Please. The board voted overwhelmingly in favor of my proposal. Even my father, after hours of argument, had to concede it was the only way forward. As people filed out of the room, he remained seated, staring at the contract he'd just signed. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly. When you left. Why didn't you tell me what you were planning? I gathered my papers calmly. Would you have believed me? 6 months ago, you couldn't even believe I was capable of understanding modern business practices. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. I was wrong, he admitted. About everything. Yes, I agreed, you were. But here's the thing about being wrong, Dad, you can learn from it. Marcus is. Will you? Standing up, I walked to my grandfather's portrait. You always said he built this company from nothing. Well, I did the same thing. The only difference is I did it without the Mitchell name. I did it as a Stewart. Your grandfather would be proud, my mother said from the doorway. He always said you were the one most like him. I turned to her, seeing years of quiet support in her eyes. The Stewart women, I said softly, remembering my grandfather's words. We build our own legacies. The merger made headlines. Stewart Digital Solutions acquires Mitchell Industries. A new chapter in tech innovation. The article mentioned the mysterious family connection between the companies, but I didn't hide it. Let everyone know that the daughter they said would be nobody had become somebody entirely on her own. Marcus started his new job the following Monday, sharing a cubicle with recent college graduates. He worked harder than I'd ever seen him work, slowly earning the respect of his colleagues. My father, after recovering from his health scare, took on an advisory role, finally learning to listen more than he spoke. A year later, I sat in my office, now in a building that bore both the Stewart and Mitchell names, looking at a framed copy of that resignation letter. Jessica knocked on my door carrying a familiar folder. Your brother's application for project manager, she said, placing it on my desk. He's completed all the requirements, earned stellar reviews from his supervisors. I smiled, thinking of how far we'd all come. Schedule the interview for Monday. Same conference room? No, I decided, use my office. It's time for a real family meeting. The nobody had built an empire, saved her family's legacy, and proved that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your critics. It's succeeding so spectacularly that they have no choice but to admit they were wrong. And as I looked out over the city that had witnessed my transformation from overlooked daughter to powerful CEO, I couldn't help but think that sometimes being nobody is the perfect way to become somebody extraordinary.
I pushed open the front door and was hit by the sharp tang of paint before I even dropped my bag. My shoes were still damp from the rain outside, my arms heavy from a 12-hour shift at the diner. But what I saw made the ache vanish in a single jolt of disbelief. 2 men in overalls stood in my bedroom, rollers sliding up and down the walls I had painted peach just months ago. My floral curtains lay crumpled on the floor, speckled with drops of white. The dresser I'd sanded and refinished on weekends sat shoved to the center of the room, streaks of paint already marking its varnish. My breath stuck in my throat. What's going on? Sylvie leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, lips curled into a smile I knew too well. It was the smile she wore when she thought she was clever. "Oh, Marina," she said lightly. "You're home early. We're just doing some renovations before we move in. Thought we'd surprise you." Her tone was casual, as if she were commenting on the weather, as if these walls were hers to change. The younger painter froze mid-stroke and glanced at me apologetically. But Sylvie didn't flinch. My legs felt unsteady beneath me. For months, this house had been my promise to myself, my proof that years of overtime and saving meant something. And here she was, treating it like a canvas for her plans. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but all that came out was a strained whisper. "Move in." Sylvie tilted her head, smug and certain. "You'll see. It'll be better this way." The smell of wet paint swirled around me, and my chest tightened as if the air itself were closing in. I realized then this was only the beginning. The words "move in" clung to me like wet clothes, and as I stood in that ruined room, my mind slipped backward to the path that had led me here. For years, I had lived paycheck to paycheck, clocking in before dawn at the diner on Lancaster Drive, the kind of place where the neon sign never turned off and the smell of fryer oil clung to your skin even after a shower. After each shift, I'd scrape together tips, count out quarters from the register I'd worked, and slide whatever was left into a small envelope I kept hidden in my closet. Student loans took their cut first, then rent on the shoebox apartment I shared with a leaky ceiling and paper-thin walls. Utilities, groceries, the bus pass each month felt like bleeding out slowly, but I learned how to stretch $1 until it bent. Nights off weren't for rest, but for side gigs bussing tables at catered events, scrubbing kitchens for extra cash, even babysitting when I could. Some weeks I thought the savings would never matter, but I kept at it. When friends bought new clothes, I patched mine. When coworkers ordered takeout, I packed leftovers in reused containers. Every sacrifice had a purpose. Then, on my 26th birthday, I signed the papers for a weathered bungalow on the north side of Salem. It wasn't much 2 bedrooms, a patch of yard, peeling paint on the siding, but it was mine. Paid with every dollar I had fought to keep. I remembered standing in the empty living room, listening to the silence, realizing I had finally bought myself a kind of freedom no one could evict me from. Or so I thought. And now, with Sylvie's voice echoing through the hall, that freedom felt like it was slipping through my hands. After that first shock, Sylvie began appearing more often, never calling ahead, just sliding into my weekends as if she were entitled to the space. At first, she brought coffee or a bag of groceries, presenting herself as thoughtful, but the conversations always turned sharp. "You're what, 27?" she said one Saturday, surveying the half-painted trim I'd been working on. "You're too young to manage all this responsibility. Houses aren't like apartments, Marina. They eat money, and you don't even know what you're getting into." I swallowed back the words I wanted to say, that I had worked every hour for this place, that I'd counted pennies and walked home in the rain to save on bus fare. Instead, I found myself staring at the chipped paint on my brush, wondering if maybe she was right. Other times, she circled the subject of my job. "Still at that diner, honey. How long do you think you can keep that up? What if you get sick? What if something happens?" The way she said it made my hands clench, because I had asked myself those same questions late at night, lying awake under the hum of the refrigerator, when Daniel, her husband, came along. He didn't bother with the soft tone. He stepped into the living room and announced, "This place would run better if we helped manage it. You've never owned property before. Mistakes cost money, and we could save you from that." I laughed nervously, but inside I felt a pit open. Their visits left me drained, second-guessing choices I'd been proud of just days before. Was the mortgage too much for me? Was the roof worse than I realized? Was I selfish for wanting to do this on my own by the time they left? I no longer felt like the owner of my own house. I felt like a tenant waiting for approval. And when Sylvie slipped her hand into mine at the door, squeezing with false warmth, I realized I couldn't tell if she was offering comfort or tightening her grip. One Friday evening, I came home late from the diner, my hands raw from scrubbing pans, and noticed the couch wasn't where I'd left it. It was angled toward the window instead of the television. A stack of my cookbooks sat in a neat row on the coffee table, as though someone had been curating them for display. My first thought was that I was too tired, that maybe I had shifted things around and forgotten. But the next morning, the kitchen confirmed the truth. My spices had been reorganized into matching jars, labels turned forward like a store shelf. Pots I kept within reach were shoved into higher cabinets. Even my coffee mugs, each chipped but precious, were stacked in the wrong order. The air smelled faintly of Sylvie's perfume, the one she wore when she wanted to seem put together. The realization sank in. She had been inside without me. I checked the doors, but nothing looked forced. That's when the memory hit 2 weeks earlier. Sylvie had asked if she could run out to her car and needed my keys to grab something she'd left behind. She must have copied them then. When she stopped by the next weekend, she was all smiles. "You really should let me help you keep this place organized. It's too much for you alone." She wandered into the kitchen, picked up my phone from the counter, and said she needed to check something for a recipe she'd texted me. She tapped and swiped for longer than made sense, laughing when I asked what she was doing. "Don't be paranoid. Marina, you're so uptight about your things." Her words lingered after she left. The house no longer felt solid. Every time I turned a corner, I wondered what else she had touched, what else she planned to rearrange. I wanted to demand my keys back, to tell her this was my house, not hers. But the thought of her reaction made my stomach twist. Instead, I locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway, staring at the key ring in my hand, knowing it wasn't the only set anymore. After discovering the truth about the keys, I stopped trusting my own memory. Each morning before leaving for work, I began snapping photos with my phone how the couch faced, where the coffee mugs sat, the way my shoes were lined up by the door. At night, I compared the pictures to what I found when I returned. Some days, nothing had changed. Other days, a book would be missing from the shelf, or the curtains would be tied differently. I wrote it all down in a small spiral notebook I kept under my mattress. The act gave me a strange calm. If Sylvie wanted to rewrite my house, at least I would keep a record of the original draft. One evening after a double shift, I told Rosa, the server I'd worked alongside for years. We were wiping down counters when I finally said it. "My sister's in my house when I'm not there." She copied my keys. Rosa's eyes narrowed. "Marina, that's not just family drama. That's trespassing. You need someone in your corner." I shrugged, embarrassed. Who's going to believe me? It's just her word against mine. But Rosa wasn't the type to shrug. The next day, she scribbled a name and number on a napkin. Whitaker, housing lawyer in Portland. My cousin used him when her landlord tried something shady. Call him. I tucked the napkin into my pocket, turning it over between my fingers all shift. The idea of involving a lawyer made my stomach tighten, but it also felt like a door I hadn't realized I could open. That night, Rosa surprised me again. She handed me a small brass keychain, the kind sold in gas stations. Etched across it, in bold letters, was one word: boundaries. "Put your house key on that," she said, "so every time you use it, you remember whose lock it really is." The weight of the brass in my palm was heavier than its size. I clipped my key onto it and slipped it into my pocket, holding it there as if it might anchor me against the storm I knew was coming. It was a gray Sunday afternoon when the pounding came at my door. I opened it to find Sylvie on the porch, 2 duffel bags at her feet, her kids fidgeting behind her. Daniel stood at the bottom of the steps with his arms folded, watching like a sentry. "We need to move in," Sylvie announced, brushing past me as if the decision had already been made. "The landlord gave us 3 days to leave. We've got nowhere else." I blocked her before she could cross the threshold. "This is my house. You can't just show up and decide you live here." Her smile cracked, replaced by the edge I knew too well. "Marina, don't be selfish. We're family. You have 2 bedrooms, and the kids need a roof over their heads. Are you really going to turn them away? The children shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but not understanding it. My chest tightened, but I held my ground. I'm not turning them away. I'm saying you can't move in here. There are other options. You can find another place. Ask Daniel's family. Anything. But not here. Sylvie's voice rose loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Listen to her. After all I've done for you, after everything our family's been through. She slams the door on her own sister across the street. Mrs. Ramirez peeked through her curtains, and two men walking their dogs slowed their steps. My face burned, but I forced myself to meet Sylvie's glare. You've crossed too many lines already, I said, steady now. This is my home. I won't let you take it. For the first time, her eyes flickered with something other than confident surprise, maybe even fear that her performance wasn't working. She grabbed one of the bags, motioning sharply for Daniel and the kids to follow. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice low but meant for me alone. Then she turned and marched down the steps, her words still echoing in my ears long after the sound of their car faded from the street. Inside, I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding, and knew that refusing her once meant she would only return stronger. The next confrontation didn't happen on my porch. It came in the form of folded papers shoved into my hands when Sylvie showed up 2 days later, smug and unhurried as if nothing had passed between us. Look, she said sweetly. Too sweetly. I just want to clear things up. I unfolded the papers. Printed screenshots of text messages stared back at me, each stamped with my number. Come live with me. Sylvie, the house is too big for one person. Bring the kids. We'll figure it out together. My throat went dry. These aren't mine. She tilted her head, pitying. You must have forgotten. You've been so stressed, working all those shifts. People slip sometimes. Then came another stack receipts for a bedroom set, a television, even kitchenware. Each purchase bore my bank account number, the same account I had dipped into sparingly, the one I thought only I had access to. You're welcome, by the way, she said. I made improvements that benefit us all. The U.S. lodged in my chest like a thorn. After she left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the evidence of a life I hadn't chosen. Had I been careless with my phone? Had she guessed my password? The more I thought about it, the more the edges blurred between what I remembered and what I might have overlooked. Rumors started floating back to me through neighbors and co-workers. Mrs. Ramirez asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that Sylvie had told her I was forgetting things. At the diner, a busboy joked about how I left my apron behind twice last week. Sylvie must have amplified that too. By the end of the week, I caught myself checking my own notebook, rereading the lines I had written, just to be certain they were true. For the first time, I wondered if maybe she was right, if maybe I was losing track of more than I realized. But when I looked at the brass keychain Rosa had given me, cool and solid in my hand, I knew I couldn't let that doubt be the final word. I carried the forged texts and receipts to Portland, hands trembling as I slid them across the desk to Mr. Whitaker. He was calm, gray-haired, the kind of man who spoke only after weighing every word. He studied the papers, then glanced at me. These messages aren't genuine, he said, tapping one with his pen. Metadata doesn't lie. There are markers of an app-generated conversation. If she presents these in court, we can dismantle them. The knot in my chest loosened slightly, but only slightly. She's already spreading stories that I'm unstable. People believe her. That's why you need more than your word. Document everything. Photos, dates, times, witnesses, 2 neighbors who saw the porch argument, co-workers who can vouch for you. It all matters. I nodded, clutching my notebook tighter. He leaned forward. And one more thing. Change your locks immediately. Every door, every entry. Do not wait. That night I barely slept, turning over every sound in the house, imagining Sylvie slipping in with her copy. At dawn, headlights swept across my yard, and a battered pickup rolled to a stop. Rosa's brother-in-law, Mark, stepped out with a toolbox. He worked quickly, hands sure, moving from the front door to the back gate, then the side entry I rarely used. I watched each old lock drop into his bucket like dead weight. When he pressed the new brass keys into my palm, their edges cool and sharp, I felt a flicker of control return. "You'll want 3 sets," he said. "One for you, one backup somewhere safe, and one with someone you trust." I slipped one onto the keychain Rosa had given me. The word boundaries gleamed in the early light. For the first time in weeks, I felt the house tighten back around me, like a door finally shut against a storm. But I also knew storms didn't disappear just because you latched the windows. At 6:30 the next morning, fists rattled the front door hard enough to shake the frame. I opened it to find 2 officers on the porch, Sylvie standing behind them with a folder clutched to her chest and triumph in her eyes. "Ms. Hale," one officer said, "we've received a complaint. Your sister claims you're holding her belongings and preventing her access to the property." Sylvie stepped forward, flipping open the folder. "She invited us to live here. I have the texts. She just forgets." She handed them the same forged messages I'd already shown Mr. Whitaker, each line dripping with a version of me that didn't exist. My hands shook, but I forced myself to speak. "Those are fake. This house is mine, and I never gave permission." I fetched the folder I'd prepared the deed with my name alone, printed photos showing furniture moved without consent, and my notebook filled with dates and details. The officers looked unconvinced, glancing between us, when headlights cut across the yard. Mr. Whitaker stepped out of his car, briefcase in hand. He greeted the officers calmly and asked to examine Sylvie's printouts. "This is fabricated," he said after a minute, pointing to the inconsistencies. "The metadata shows it was generated by a third-party app. If this goes further, the forgery itself could be prosecuted." The officers stiffened. One turned to me. "Do you want these items removed from the house now, under supervision?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. For the next hour, Sylvie and Daniel carried their suitcases and boxes out under the officers' eyes. The bedroom set they'd bought with my stolen money went too. Piece by piece, until the house stood bare of their presence. When the patrol car finally rolled away, silence fell heavy and clean. I stood at the window, brass key warm in my hand, knowing the final word hadn't yet been spoken. The morning after the police left, I walked through each room slowly, letting the quiet settle into my bones. For the first time in weeks, there were no unfamiliar footsteps, no perfume lingering in the air, no furniture shifted from its place. It was just me and the house I had fought for. I didn't waste time. That same week, I filed for a restraining order with Mr. Whitaker's help. The paperwork was exhausting, but I signed each page with a steady hand. At night, Mark returned to install a small camera by the front door and another near the back gate. Watching the screens glow on my phone gave me a strange comfort. The house was no longer open ground. It was mine to defend. Rosa came by with bags of potting soil, and together we planted daisies and lavender along the walkway. I knelt in the dirt, pressing roots into the earth, feeling something loosen inside me with each handful of soil. This was my line drawn in petals and stems, my proof that beauty could grow even after intrusion. When the garden was done, I went inside and hung the brass keychain Rosa had given me on a nail in the kitchen wall. The word boundaries gleamed against the paint. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, remembering how small and fragile I had felt when Sylvie first crossed my threshold. Now, at 27, I understood that independence wasn't guaranteed by a deed or a set of locks. It was a choice I would have to defend again and again. Fragile, yes, but still mine. When freedom arrives too early, do you protect it with fear or with pride? The ink was barely dry on the closing papers when I stepped out onto the deck of my new house in Nag's Head. The wind carried the sharp tang of the Atlantic, the kind of salt air that clung to your skin and whispered of freedom. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe as though the air belonged to me. The house wasn't extravagant, just weathered shingles, wide windows, and a view of the dunes that bent gracefully toward the water. But it was mine, a space I had carved from years of quiet labor, a declaration that I no longer lived under anyone's shadow. The phone rang before I'd even set down the folder with my deed. Marcella's name lit up the screen. My sister's voice came through sharp, practiced in command, leaving no space for me to speak. "We'll arrive in 3 hours with 22 of my in-laws. Clear the rooms. Fix meals for everyone. We're staying 2 weeks." Her words landed not as a request, but as a decree, as though the house had always been hers. I stood in the empty living room, the ocean spilling light across the bare floorboards, and felt a familiar sting tighten in my chest. I knew this tone. I had grown up with it, bent beneath it, learned to quiet myself while she barked orders that our parents always rushed to fulfill. Still, I didn't answer right away. I let her words echo against the walls that had never known her, never sheltered her. The house was mine, bought with my savings, my effort, my name etched cleanly on the deed. On the outside, I stayed steady, my voice, even when I finally said, "I hear you, Marcella," inside. Something else stirred an old ache, mixing with a steel I hadn't felt in years. I ended the call and stared at the horizon, the water restless but constant. 3 hours. That was the time she had given me, and I already knew it would be enough. As I stood in the quiet of my beach house, the past rose up like the tide, dragging me back to Raleigh, where Marcella and I first learned our roles. She was the fire, always demanding, always certain the world owed her a place at the head of the table. I was the patient one, smoothing sharp edges, holding silence when silence seemed the only way to keep peace. Our parents encouraged it without realizing, praising her boldness, excusing her tantrums, and leaning on me to be the steady one who didn't make trouble. I remember birthday dinners where Marcella insisted on the biggest slice of cake, and my parents would laugh, handing it over. I remember school projects where she bragged loudly about what she hadn't done, and I was the one up late finishing it, too tired to protest. By the time we reached high school, the pattern was fixed. Marcella pushed, I yielded. She demanded, I delivered. And when our parents died years later, nothing changed, it only hardened. Marcella seized control of the estate, speaking as though she alone carried the family name. Relatives deferred to her. I became the background figure, the sibling who never fought, the one assumed to agree. My words rarely landed. If I questioned her, she twisted it into selfishness or weakness, and everyone nodded along. I slipped into the role so deeply that I hardly recognized the quiet bitterness building inside me. That phone call in my beach house was not new. It was the same voice that had dictated my life since childhood, expecting compliance. But as the waves crashed outside my window, I realized the ground beneath me had shifted. The deed in my folder wasn't just paper. It was proof that I had finally stepped out from the long shadow of her control. I could almost see us as children again, Marcella stamping her foot, me folding my hands to keep from trembling. Yet here, in Nag's head, it wasn't fear that filled me. It was a kind of calm resolve I had never known, the sense that I could finally decide what role I would play. And with 3 hours ahead of me, I was already choosing. When our parents passed, I believed grief might soften Marcella's grip. That loss might teach her to share. Instead, it gave her more room to tighten her hold. The estate was divided on paper, but in practice, Marcella spoke as if everything bore her name alone. She carried herself like the heir apparent, a queen without crown or consent. Relatives nodded, neighbors deferred, and I, tired from years of smoothing arguments, kept quiet longer than I should have. The family farm in Johnston County went first. It had been my father's pride, rows of soybeans and corn stretching past the horizon. I wanted to keep it, or at least lease the land so it stayed in production. Marcella insisted on selling. Too much work, she said, though she'd never lifted a hand in the fields. Within months, it was gone, parceled to developers, flattened for tract housing. Then the house in Raleigh. Our childhood rooms still smelled faintly of cedar from the old closets. I suggested restoring it, even living there while we figured out what came next. Marcella brought in contractors within weeks, tearing down walls, gutting the rooms. By the time she was finished, the place was unrecognizable, our memories scrubbed as though they were stains. I stood by through each decision, my protests brushed aside with a laugh or a sharp word. She called it practical. I knew it for what it was: control. The same pattern that had shaped us since we were children, piece by piece. What could have been shared was swallowed by her certainty. The beach house was supposed to be different. It wasn't inherited, wasn't tied to our past. It was bought with my money. The result of years of shifts at Duke Regional, of living frugally while others assumed I had nothing of my own. I imagined it as a clean slate, a place free of Marcella's reach. But her call reminded me she didn't need to own the deed to lay claim. Entitlement had always been her currency. And now, with the Atlantic outside my window and 3 hours ticking down, I understood that I couldn't let history repeat itself again. I knew the trap the moment I hung up. If I told Marcella no directly, it would spiral the way it always had. She would raise her voice, twist my refusal into cruelty, and by the time the shouting settled, I would be the one branded ungrateful or selfish. That had been the rhythm of our lives, her demanding, me defending, and everyone else nodding along as if her version of events was the only truth. But this house was not a shared inheritance. It was mine, a line drawn in ink and witnessed by law. I could not let her turn it into another battlefield where I came away the loser. For once, I would not fight on her terms. I pulled out the folder I'd carried since closing and flipped through the notes I had scribbled in the margins. During the process of buying, I'd gathered names, local services, management companies, contacts in case I ever wanted to rent the house seasonally. I had thought of them as possibilities for the future. Now they became tools for survival. I called a property manager in Nag's Head, explained I needed the house booked immediately, and asked if he had tenants ready. He did tourists waiting for an opening, willing to pay above market for a last-minute stay. We set the contract in motion. Then I called a catering company in Kill Devil Hills, arranging food delivery that very evening. Last, I placed a call to a moving crew, requesting they be on standby in case I needed help with linens and furniture. With each call, a strange calm settled in me. I wasn't panicked, wasn't racing. I was deliberate, precise, as though every year of silence had been preparing me for this moment. Marcella had given me 3 hours. That was enough. When I set the phone down, the house seemed to steady around me. The ocean beyond the glass sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for her storm to pass. I was preparing for it. I moved through the house slowly, room by room, letting my hand graze the bare walls as if to anchor myself. Each space was still unmarked by furniture or family photographs, a blank canvas waiting for me to decide what it would hold. I paused in the largest bedroom, picturing the view Marcella would have claimed for herself, barking orders while everyone else fell in line. The thought no longer filled me with dread, it only sharpened my resolve. The property manager called back within the hour. A family from Virginia Beach had been desperate for a 2-week rental and would arrive that evening. They had already wired the deposit higher than market rate for the last-minute booking. His tone carried both surprise and respect when I agreed without hesitation. I could hear the clicking of his keyboard as he confirmed the paperwork. The house would be ready, he promised, and he would arrive personally to oversee the handoff. I hung up and walked into the kitchen. The counters gleamed, empty except for my folder and the stack of papers I had carried from Raleigh. I opened the envelope I had kept hidden for years, photocopies of withdrawals Marcella had made from the family trust, transactions written under my name when I was too weary to fight. I remembered the nights I'd come home from Duke Regional after double shifts, smelling of disinfectant and exhaustion, while she drained accounts I had helped build. I slid the documents into the fireproof safe I had tucked into a closet. They weren't just records, they were proof that I hadn't imagined the theft, that my silence had a cost. I wasn't ready to use them, not yet. but knowing they were close by steadied me more than the locked door or deed. When I closed the safe and turned the key, I felt the house shift from fragile to fortified. The rooms no longer seemed vulnerable. They felt prepared, and so was I, as the sound of distant tires on the highway reminded me the hours were slipping away. The first car rolled into the driveway just as the sun began its slow dip toward the water. Within minutes, more followed, a caravan of minivans and SUVs spilling onto the street until the curb was jammed with unfamiliar license plates. Doors slammed, voices rose, and children bolted across the sand path toward the porch as if it already belonged to them. Laughter carried on the wind, too loud for walls that had never held them. Marcella stepped out of the lead car like a commander surveying her conquest. She didn't knock, didn't pause. Instead, she began directing bodies, pointing to the second floor for luggage, waving toward the kitchen for the boxes of groceries they had brought. Her in-laws moved as though rehearsed, hauling coolers and suitcases without so much as a glance in my direction. To them, this house was already theirs for 2 weeks, and I was nothing more than the doorman holding the key. I stood in the entryway, calm, my hands steady at my sides. Years ago, I would have rushed forward to help, to ease the transition, to make myself useful so as not to cause waves. But now I waited, watching as Marcella barked. "Get the children settled upstairs. Leave the wine on the counter. Celeste, where are the spare linens?" Her eyes flicked past me, already calculating which room she would claim for herself. The largest bedroom, of course the one with the ocean view. It was the same look I had seen on her face as a girl, when she would stamp her foot until our parents gave her the biggest slice, the better toy, the louder praise. "Don't unload," I said finally, my voice even but clear. The words landed like a stone in water. For the first time since they'd arrived, the noise paused, suitcases hung midair. A cooler shifted awkwardly in someone's arms. Marcella turned, disbelief flashing into irritation. "What do you mean? Don't unload. This is the house. We're here." I met her stare without flinching. "Not tonight. Marcella." The silence stretched, taut as a rope pulled to breaking, and in that stillness, I felt the tide of the evening begin to turn. Marcella's eyes narrowed, her voice slicing through the heavy pause. "What are you talking about? Of course we're unloading. Everyone's exhausted from the drive." She snapped her fingers at one of the cousins, urging him toward the staircase. I didn't move. "The house is booked," I said, steady as the tide outside. "Paying guests arrive tonight. You'll need to take your things back to the cars." For a moment, no one reacted, as if my words were in a language they couldn't translate. Then confusion rippled across the group. A few of the in-laws shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, the weight of their coolers suddenly awkward in their arms. One cousin muttered, almost under his breath, "We didn't know. Right on cue." The property manager appeared at the end of the drive, clipboard in hand, his shirt crisp, his stride brisk. He greeted me first, then turned to Marcella with professional detachment. "Ma'am, this property has been reserved. 2 weeks, paid in advance, at above market rate. I'm here to prepare for the renter's arrival." The whispers grew louder, embarrassment coloring faces that had moments ago been full of laughter. Marcella's expression twisted, disbelief colliding with outrage. "This is ridiculous. We're your family. Strangers don't come before us." I let the silence breathe before answering. "This isn't a family hostel. It's an investment. One I worked for, one I own, and one that will pay for itself starting tonight." A line had been drawn, and they could all see it. Some in-laws avoided my eyes. Others stepped back toward their vehicles, shifting from her side to neutrality. The strength of her entourage faltered, and the certainty she always wore like armor began to crack. Marcella looked around, waiting for someone to back her, to echo her outrage. But the crowd behind her was no longer unified. It was splintering, the loyalty she counted on dissolving into awkward silence. Her face flushed crimson as she turned back to me, her voice rising. desperate to reclaim the ground she was losing, but I had already set the stage for what came next. Marcella's fury was rising, her voice pitched sharp enough to cut glass. When I reached into the folder I had carried from Raleigh, I pulled out a plain envelope, thick with papers, and held it out between us. She hesitated, suspicion flickering across her face before she snatched it from my hand. Her bravado faltered as she flipped through the pages. Bank records, copies of trust withdrawals, each line stamped with her signature beside my name. Years of siphoning disguised as practical management. I had kept them quietly, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be weakness but weapon. Her hands shook as the papers rattled in the wind. Rage twisted across her features, but underneath it I saw something sharper. Fear. For once, her control was not absolute. "If you ever touch this house," I said evenly, "every dollar you stole becomes public record. Court, community, everyone. I won't stay silent again." A hush fell over the driveway. One of her in-laws, a man I barely recognized, shifted uncomfortably before taking two children by the hand, guiding them back toward the car. His eyes met mine briefly, full of apology that wasn't his to give. The sound of a car door closing punctured the tension, reminding everyone this wasn't a family gathering. It was a reckoning. Marcella's voice cracked when she tried to rally, the confident edge slipping. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed, but it lacked the force it once carried. Her audience was thinning, her power unraveling in the daylight. I stood firm, letting her see the calm in me she could not shake. She clutched the envelope, desperate and cornered, her fury no longer landing the way it used to. The silence around us wasn't mine alone anymore. It belonged to everyone watching her stumble. And as more relatives edged back toward their cars, I knew the collapse was only beginning. Engines turned over one by one as the caravan began to unravel. Doors slammed. Muffled voices carried across the street, and I caught fragments of whispers, remarks about Marcella's arrogance, her habit of taking too much for granted. The crowd that had arrived with such noise and certainty now scattered in quiet retreat, each step away chipping at the authority she had worn like armor. Marcella stood rooted in the driveway, clutching the envelope as if it might vanish if she let go. Her voice rose in jagged bursts, calling after her in-laws, insisting they stay, trying to gather them back under her command, but they kept moving, eyes down, unwilling to return to her side. The children were buckled into cars, coolers shoved hastily into trunks, and one by one the vehicles pulled away from the house she had thought was hers to claim. As the last of the caravan disappeared, the caterers arrived, vans unloading trays of food meant for guests who would appreciate them. Movers carried in fresh linens, their steps sure and practiced, resetting the house not for family, but for paying tenants. The transition was seamless, as if Marcella's invasion had been nothing more than a brief disturbance in the tide. She screamed then, a raw sound that cracked in the open air. Rage, humiliation, disbelief, all of it spilling into the afternoon light with no one left to catch it. Her power had evaporated, her audience gone, leaving her exposed in a way I had never seen. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence held more weight than her shouting ever could. I had drawn the line, and this time it held. When I closed the door, the house seemed to exhale with me, already turning toward the quiet I had earned. That night, I carried a chair onto the deck and let the sound of the waves wash through me. The sand shimmered pale in the moonlight, the Atlantic restless but steady, a rhythm older than anything Marcella or I had ever fought over. Above me, the stars stretched wide and sharp, unbothered by the noise of the day. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down, no shadow stretching across my steps. I thought of the girl I had been, the one who yielded, who swallowed her words so that Marcella's could carry. That girl had walked behind her sister in Raleigh kitchens and crowded schoolyards, always the one to smooth the path, to absorb the sting. For decades, I had mistaken patience for weakness, silence for safety. But sitting there, the salt air on my face, I understood the truth. I had never been weak. I had been waiting. The house around me wasn't just wood, glass, and paint. It was proof that years of double shifts, frugal choices, and quiet resolve had built something solid. It was a line drawn in cedar and stone, a reminder that I could claim space without apology. Marcella's voice no longer filled the night. Her demands, her certainty, her entitlement had slipped into the past, and with them went the part of me that had always bent. I leaned back, listening to the ocean beat its endless rhythm, and felt the key warm in my pocket. The deed was mine, but more than that, so was the story. This house was not just an investment. It was my declaration that I would never again be erased. The revolving doors at Horizon PR released me into the September evening, the riverfront lights of Chicago flickering like a celebration I wasn't invited to. My heels struck the pavement in a rhythm that felt too sharp for the occasion. 32 years old today, senior executive with more accounts than I could juggle, and yet I carried myself home with the weight of a child who still hoped for balloons. By the time I reached my apartment in River North, my phone had remained stubbornly silent. No calls, no texts, no reminders that the day belonged to me. On the coffee table sat the cake I'd picked up that morning, single layer, white frosting, a candle standing at attention like a soldier waiting for orders. I set down my bag, stared at it for a moment, and turned away before the sting grew too sharp. Habit made me open my laptop, telling myself I'd bury the silence in another proposal draft. But one slip of the trackpad, and Facebook bloomed across the screen. The first post froze me. My brother Dane, standing poolside in Evanston, champagne glass aloft. Behind him, a banner stretched in neat blue letters. "Congratulations on your promotion." Photo after photo scrolled past our parents flanking him, cousins I hadn't seen in years, the entire Elwood clan gathered under string lights and neon reflections on the water, all of them smiling, celebrating, while my birthday passed unnoticed a few miles away. The unlit candle in my living room became heavier than any weight I'd carried from the office. I closed the laptop slowly, as though shutting a door on something too familiar, and leaned back against the cushions, knowing this erasure had not started tonight but years ago. The images from Dane's pool party stayed with me long after I shut the laptop. They weren't just tonight's betrayal. They were part of a thread woven through every stage of my life, tight enough to choke. At 11, I had worn my best dress to the family diner near the high school, waiting at a booth with a cupcake balanced on a chipped plate. My parents had promised they'd return in time from Dane's swim meet across town. I counted the minutes, candle burning low, until a waitress took pity and sang a soft, embarrassed version of Happy Birthday while other customers looked on. My family never came. When they arrived home that night, the trophy gleamed in Dane's hand, and my cupcake sat untouched in the fridge. 6 years later, on my 17th birthday, I packed an overnight bag for Grandma's house. My parents had arranged a weekend trip to Dartmouth, Dane's dream school. "It's his future, Maris," my father said, his tone final. Grandma baked me a pie and did her best to make the day feel special, but I felt the truth in every slice that I was an afterthought. Even college graduation offered no reprieve. Madison's spring air was bright, and I walked across the stage summa cum laude, certain for one fleeting moment that I might finally shine. But that evening, at the dinner meant for me, Dane stood up, clinking his glass to announce his engagement. The conversation shifted instantly, the spotlight moving as if I had never stepped on stage at all. My diploma felt weightless beside the diamond ring flashing on Jessica's hand. I learned to smile, to fade into the edges of photographs, to pretend it didn't matter. But watching the Evanston pool lights on my screen tonight, I knew the pattern wasn't accidental. It was tradition. The small cake on my table seemed to accuse me for waiting so long, its unlit candle echoing all the times my milestones had been dimmed, and I understood that tomorrow would demand something different, the morning after my birthday. I walked into Horizon PR's offices with the heaviness of the night still clinging to me, yet the world inside those glass walls spun on a different axis. Lawrence, our CEO, intercepted me before I'd even reached my desk, a folder in his hand and a rare spark of excitement in his eyes. "Maris, the quarterly numbers just came in," he said, pressing the papers toward me. 41% revenue growth on the Hanover campaign. The board is beyond pleased. I scanned the figures, my pulse quickening with each line. It was the kind of result most executives dreamed of, the sort of proof that silenced doubters. Lawrence's smile softened as he added, "You've earned this," and slipped an envelope onto my desk. Inside was the formal letter and confirmation an $82,000 performance bonus. For a moment I couldn't move. My entire career had been spent clawing for acknowledgement, not just at home, but everywhere. Now here it was in black and white evidence that my work mattered, that my presence created measurable impact. I thanked him, voice steadier than I felt, and carried the envelope back to my office like it was something fragile. That night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving and allowed myself to taste victory, if only briefly. The city glowed outside my windows, headlights tracing lines of light across the river. My phone buzzed, and for one foolish heartbeat, I thought it might be someone finally remembering yesterday. "Mom," the screen read. I answered quickly, hope rising despite everything. "Maris, darling," she began, her voice bright. Relief washed through me until she continued. "We're planning something for Dane and Jessica's anniversary next month, and I was hoping you could help with the catering and decorations. You're so good at those things." I gripped the stem of my glass, the words pressing into me with their casual cruelty. Not a mention of my birthday, not a question about my day, only another request to make Dane shine brighter. I murmured a vague agreement and ended the call, staring at the envelope on my desk. The bonus sat there like a crossroads, and I knew it wouldn't be long before my family tried to claim it as theirs. 2 days after that call, an unexpected notification appeared on my phone. A message thread blinked across the screen. The title, Elwood Family. I frowned. I'd never been invited into one of their group chats before. For a moment I thought maybe finally they wanted to include me. Then the messages unfolded. Charles Maris should contribute at least $20,000 for Dane's anniversary. Venue and catering aren't cheap. Elaine, she just got that bonus time she supports family for once. I stared, pulse thrumming in my ears. 20,000, a quarter of what I had worked years to earn. I scrolled further. Jokes about how generous Dane had always been, how the legacy needed to be honored. And then, the final insult my name typed as Maris. 2 S's, not even corrected. It shouldn't have cut so deep, but it did. A lifetime of being overlooked condensed into a single typo. Not even my mother could be bothered to spell her daughter's name right while discussing how to siphon money from her. My hands shook as I locked the phone, setting it face down on my desk. Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered with its usual confidence, but inside I felt something shifting, hardening. For years I had swallowed these moments whole, smiling, nodding, quietly accepting the erasure. But this was different. This was written proof. Undeniable and merciless. I picked the phone back up, rereading until the words blurred. Support the family. As if I had never supported them with silence, with patience, with all the years of standing in Dane's shadow. That night, the envelope with my bonus letter lay beside me on the table, its edges sharp against the dim light. For the first time, I wasn't just hurt, I was angry. And the anger didn't feel fleeting. It felt like fuel, carrying me toward the dinner they had planned for the weekend. The Elwood house in Winnetka looked as polished as ever, its white stone exterior glowing in the early evening light. I parked at the curb, my hands gripping the steering wheel longer than necessary. Walking up the path felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict was already written. Inside, the scene played out as predictably as a script I had memorized since childhood. My mother fussed with flowers in the dining room. My father poured himself a scotch by the fire, and Dane lounged on the sofa, tan from some weekend trip. We exchanged pleasantries over salmon and asparagus, the conversation circling inevitably toward my brother's achievements. Then, as dessert plates were set down, my father cleared his throat. "Maris, we need to discuss your contribution to Dane and Jessica's anniversary celebration." His voice carried the weight of command. "Not request." My mother chimed in quickly. "Pearls catching the chandelier light. 20,000 would cover the venue and catering. Family supports. Family. Darling." For years, those words had been a leash. Tonight, I felt them snap. "I can't," I said quietly. The room stilled. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My father's brows knit together. "I beg your pardon, I can't contribute $20,000. I repeated, my tone steadier this time. "That's a quarter of my bonus. I have other plans for it." A silence spread across the table, thick and unyielding. My mother blinked, her smile faltering. "After everything we've done for you, what exactly have you done for me?" The words slipped out before I could catch them. They hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. My father rose, looming over the table. "Ingratitude will not be tolerated in this house. Your brother is the real achiever. The least you can do is support him." My hands trembled as I gathered my purse, but my voice stayed firm. "Then I suppose I don't belong in this house." I walked out before the guilt could root itself in me again, the night air cool against my skin. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from Ivy. When I told her what had happened, she didn't hesitate. "What exactly have they done for you lately?" Her question lingered in the silence, pointing me toward an answer I had avoided for too long. The days after Winnetka passed in a blur of silence from my family, broken only by Ivy's steady voice, reminding me that no was a complete sentence. Still, the echo of my father's anger and my mother's feigned tears lingered. I needed something more than words to prove I was done playing my part in their script. Late one night, I opened my laptop and typed Michigan lakefront property. The listings rolled across the screen: cabins, cottages, sprawling homes perched above wide blue water. One in particular held me, a cedar-shingled cottage near South Haven, built in the 1940s. 4 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, a wraparound deck facing the lake. The photos showed mature pines hemming in the yard, the kind of quiet that looked like a promise. 2 days later, I stood on that deck, the September air sharp with the scent of water and wood smoke. The realtor explained the owners had already moved to Arizona. They were motivated to sell. My credit was solid, my bonus intact. For once, every piece aligned. "I'll take it," I heard myself say. The words sounded foreign, bold, but entirely right. At the closing, Mrs. Harrington sat beside me, her hands folded over her purse. She had insisted on coming, declaring that no one should sign papers for a new home alone. When the final document slid across the table, she placed her hand lightly over mine. "Sometimes freedom isn't a gift," she said softly. "It's a choice." I scrawled my name with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The keys slid into my palm, small and metallic yet heavier than anything I had carried home from an office. Driving back to Chicago with the deed tucked into my bag, I realized the Elwood family could keep their pool parties and staged photos. I had something better, a sanctuary of my own making, and a lock that only my key could open. The first weekend at the cottage, I woke to light streaming through wide windows and the sound of gulls sweeping low over the water. The air smelled of pine and possibility. I carried my coffee onto the cedar deck. barefoot, and took a photo almost without thinking just me. The lake stretching endless behind me, the railing still rough from fresh stain. On the caption line, I typed birthday gift to myself. Then I pressed post. By the time I rinsed my mug, my phone vibrated with a flood of notifications. 17 missed calls within the first hour. Dozens of texts piling on top of each other. My mother's name appeared again and again. How could you do this without us? You're making the family look bad. Call me immediately. I set the phone down, letting it buzz itself into silence. For once, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. That evening, the cottage filled with people who had shown up for me in ways my family never had. Ivy arrived first with a bottle of wine and her irreverent humor. Colleagues from Horizon followed, their laughter spilling across the rooms. Mrs. Harrington appeared last, carrying a quilt in shades of blue and green. Every home needs something stitched with love, she said, pressing it into my arms. We grilled on the deck, music humming softly from a speaker, the lake catching the last gold of the day. I looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight, realizing I didn't need a family's approval to feel celebrated. I only needed people who saw me, who chose to be here. While my phone lit up inside with more accusations, I poured another glass of wine and raised it with my friends, knowing the real reckoning with my parents was still to come. The invitation to dinner came as a command, not a request. Sunday, 7 sharp. We need to talk, my father's voice had said over the phone, clipped and final. I drove to Winnetka with 3 photo albums stacked on the passenger seat and a folder of receipts tucked beneath them. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the leather groaned. Inside, the mansion looked the same as always, grand, immaculate, a museum of appearances. My mother greeted me with tissues already in her hand, eyes rimmed with carefully smudged eyeliner. My father stood rigid by the fireplace, glass of scotch in hand. Dane shifted uneasily on the sofa, his wife's smile brittle beside him. We sat at the dining table, the good china gleaming under candlelight. My father wasted no time. Your behavior has been reckless. Buying property without consulting us, broadcasting it online. This reflects poorly on the family. I slid the first album onto the table. Let's talk about family. The pages opened to Dane's birthday's pool parties crowded with friends. A car wrapped in a bow at 18, parents beaming in every frame. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I placed the second album beside it. Sparse pages, store-bought cupcakes, a photo of me at 11 with Grandma, the only candle already half melted. This is mine, I said. My mother's hand trembled as she turned the empty pages. The third item was a spreadsheet, highlighted and color-coded. Tuition paid in full for Dane, partial scholarships for me, vacations abroad for him, summer camps for me, thousands against hundreds. The numbers told their own story. Finally. I unfolded a diary page in faded pencil. Maybe next year they'll remember my birthday without Grandma calling. The silence that followed was heavier than the air itself. My mother began to cry, this time without calculation. My father's face flushed dark, his voice strangled. Dane's eyes stayed fixed on a photo of himself at 8. My younger face blurred in the background, smiling too tightly. I gathered my bag but left the albums and papers in the center of the table. Consider them a gift, I said, and walked out into the night, the weight I carried shifting into something sharper resolve for whatever came next. The following weekend, I drove back to South Haven with the trunk of my car filled with groceries, wine, and flowers. The air felt different as I unlocked the door, lighter somehow, as if the cottage itself had been waiting for me to arrive with company. This time, the silence wasn't loneliness, it was anticipation. By late afternoon, the rooms began to fill. Ivy appeared first, arms loaded with bags of food, her laugh carrying through the hallway before I even saw her. Soon, colleagues from Horizon followed, shaking off the drive from Chicago, setting bottles on the counter and slipping out onto the deck to admire the lake view. The house that had once been only an idea on a realtor's listing now pulsed with warmth and voices. As the sun dipped low, we gathered on the deck with plates of grilled food balanced on our laps. Ivy raised her glass and grinned. "To the woman who chose herself," she said, her voice steady but eyes bright with pride. The cheer that followed was louder than any toast I'd ever heard in my parents' dining room. Mrs. Harrington arrived just as twilight colored the water. She pressed a bundle into my arms, a quilt pieced together in blues and greens, stitched by hand. "Every home deserves something made with love," she whispered. I blinked back tears as I unfolded it across the back of a chair, the fabric catching the last gold light of the day. For the first time in 32 years, my birthday was marked not by absence or disappointment, but by presence by people who had shown up because they wanted to, not because they were obligated. I sat back, letting their laughter wash over me, and felt a sense of belonging I had stopped believing was possible. The quilt draped across the chair behind me seemed less like a gift and more like a foundation. And I knew as I looked out at the lake that this tradition would begin here and grow only stronger. By the time my 33rd birthday arrived, the cottage no longer felt new. The walls bore framed photos from campaigns I had led, shelves sagged with books I'd promised myself time to read, and the quilt from Mrs. Harrington lay folded across the sofa like a constant reminder that love could be stitched together. I had been promoted to senior director at Horizon that spring, and tonight the house once again filled with the voices of friends who had become family. The deck buzzed with conversation, glasses clinking against the backdrop of Lake Michigan turning gold in the late light. Ivy raised a toast, calling me the best risk-taker she knew, and laughter rolled easily through the air. For once, joy didn't feel fragile, it felt earned. When a car pulled into the gravel drive, I expected another colleague arriving late. Instead, it was Dane. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the deck, a package in his hands. "I wanted to give you this," he said quietly. Inside the wrapping was a restored photograph, me at 7, hair tangled, laughing on a tire swing. "Found it in Dad's boxes," he explained. "Thought you should have it." Later, after the crowd thinned, my mother appeared at the door, a small bakery box trembling in her hands. Inside was a single cupcake with one candle. "Carrot cake," she said, her voice catching. "You always liked it." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. As the sun sank and the last of my guests drifted inside, I stood on the deck with the photo in one hand and the cupcake in the other. I lifted my glass toward the horizon, no longer waiting for recognition to come from them, but knowing I could create it myself.